So I hope everyone had a nice break. We're still coming back. This was your dinner break, right? Maybe it was a bit rushed to eat dinner in just 1 hour. Okay, so what I plan to do is begin this session with another meditation from the book, Fearless Heart. So this meditation will be similar to the one we did just before, but that one was focusing more on loving kindness, whereas this one is focusing more on compassion. So we'll bring to mind a person that we know and care about, have good feelings towards, and then contemplate some problem, difficult experience that they're having now or did have in the past, and then see if we can generate the feeling of compassion for this person and then meditate on that. So are we ready to begin? Everyone here who's supposed to be here?
I think so, Venerable.
Okay. So let's make ourselves comfortable. So try to find a good position. Try to keep your back straight while still keeping your body relaxed, free of tension. You can take 3 deep breaths, breathing in slowly, deeply, pausing for a moment, and then exhaling slowly, either through your nose or through your mouth, letting the air out slowly. And imagine if there's any tension in your body or in your mind, that it goes out with the breath. So do that 3 times, then go back to normal breathing. So now just allow your breath to flow in and out in a natural way without interfering with it, trying to control it. Just let your body breathe. And then with your mind, your awareness, be aware of the breath as it's coming in and going out. Just try to do this for each breath, one breath after another. And try to stay with the full duration of each breath without your mind jumping to other things. But if that does happen, it's normal. Don't feel upset. So other thoughts might arise in your mind, or you might hear sounds. So your mind might be distracted by those other things. So that's normal. But as soon as you can, let go of that other object and bring your mind, your awareness back to your breathing. Okay, so now bring to mind a person you know and care about. It could be the same person you used before in the last meditation, or a different person. But it needs to be somebody who is either going through a difficult experience at the present or did have such an experience in the past. And if you can, imagine that person in front of you. If that's difficult to do, it's enough just to think of the person. You might even think of where they are right now. Imagine them sitting in their home or place of work. And then contemplate the difficulty the person is having now at the present time, or in the past when they were having this difficult experience. And try to understand or imagine what it's like for them to have this difficulty. So this is using empathy, the ability to understand another person's feelings, experiences. And when doing this, try to be aware if you have a sense of despair, sadness, powerlessness. So compassion is beyond empathy. With empathy, we might just feel helpless and sad, but it's not very helpful to get stuck in that feeling. Compassion really cares about the other person and wants to help them be free of their difficulties, of their suffering. And then we look for ways in which we can do that, or at least try to do that. Talking to the person, offering them something. So right now, since we're not physically present with the other person, we can't do anything verbally or physically, but mentally, we can meditate on compassion, increase our compassion for that person. And that is helpful. It's helpful for ourselves, and it's also helpful for others. So the way of generating compassion or increasing compassion is to say things to ourselves, repeat phrases in our mind about this other person. So contemplating the other person and how they're going through this difficulty, say to yourself, may you be free from suffering. And you can play around with the words and change the words if you want, as long as they do have that kind of meaning, wishing the person to be free from their suffering. And you can repeat that phrase several times, trying to really feel the meaning of the words. And the next phrase is, may you be free from fear and anxiety. And then may you find safety and peace. And then we'll do those phrases one more time. May you be free from suffering. May you be free from fear and anxiety. May you find safety and peace. Now imagine from your heart, light, rays of light, radiant, bright, warm, like sunlight, going from your heart to this person, going into their heart, and then spreading from there to fill their whole body. Their whole body and mind gets filled with this light, which is your compassion, your kindness, your care. Imagine that it eases their suffering, bringing peace and tranquility. Some people might have doubt about the effectiveness of this kind of meditation, thinking, oh, we're just imagining it, nothing's happening. But in the book, it mentions some research that was done by one American psychologist who taught loving kindness meditation. She went into a company, a large software and IT company. So these are just ordinary people, working people. And there were two groups of people. So one group learned this meditation for 1 hour a week. They would learn and practice meditation on loving kindness. And the other group didn't learn this meditation. They didn't get it. And then they, checked the results of this. And after, I'm not sure how long, 6 weeks. Yeah, just after 6 weeks, then the people who had been practicing this kind of meditation just for 1 hour a week reported that they had much more positive experiences, more love, more joy, gratitude, contentment, hope, and so on. So they had more positive feelings. Yeah. But then you might think, but what good does it do to other people? And I was thinking about Reiki. Reiki is this sort of healing method. And I know a few people who practice Reiki, and they have what they call distance Reiki, where you practice Reiki for somebody who's not right there in front of you, but could be far away, even on the other side of the world. I don't know exactly how they do it, but it's probably similar to this, where they imagine sending this positive energy to the person who's sick or in pain. And it works. The recipient does feel better, does sometimes get completely healed. So you may have heard of this before, distance healing. Apparently it can work. So even if we're sitting in our home and we're visualizing somebody and imagining we're sending them positive energy, it can work. I don't know if it works all the time, 100% of the time. It might depend on various other factors, but it can work. And even if it may not work for the other person, it does do something for you. It does help you to have a more positive state of mind, to have more compassion, more love. And that's a good thing. If you can have more compassion, then the way you treat other people will be better for them. So I wanted to answer a question that was sent from yesterday, from last night. Because I gave this example of the man who climbed the building and rescued the little child that was hanging from the balcony. And I said this was an example of compassion. So somebody sent in a question about that, how is saving lives compassion? How is that compassion? And I'm a little surprised by that question. But it could be that some people have the idea that compassion is some kind of very high state of mind that only people like the Dalai Lama have, or the saints, Mother Teresa, they have compassion, but ordinary people like ourselves, no, we don't have compassion. So I don't think that's true. If you think about the explanation that I gave last night of what is compassion, like in Thupten Jinpa's book, he explained the meaning of compassion. And it starts with recognizing that there's suffering or need in another person or another being. That's the first step. The second step is the sense of concern, sympathy and concern. And then the third step is wanting to relieve that suffering, wanting to do something to stop that suffering. And he says those three things can happen very quickly, almost simultaneously. So with regard to that man, of course, we can't really know what is going on in another person's mind unless we have that kind of clairvoyance. We can see into people's minds and know what's really going on in there. But just based on his action, his behavior, what he did, to me, it seems like that's compassion. He saw there was a need. He felt concerned. He acted on it. Why is that not compassion? Because again, Buddhism says, and it seems like Western science and philosophy is now accepting that, yeah, compassion is part of our human nature. Even little children, small infants who pre-verbal, they're not even able to speak yet, but they show signs of compassion. So why should that be surprising that this man acted out of compassion? But I was thinking that in some cases, maybe with some people who do rescue work, firemen, or I don't know what they're called, rescuers who rescue people and animals. It's possible there may be some ego. Yeah, there may be some pride, wanting to show off, wanting to impress people. Look at me, how courageous I am. That might be there in some people. I can't know for sure. But even if that's the case, even if there is some ego and some pride, there's probably also compassion. Because I think that our human mind is so complex. It's changing all the time. Every minute, every second, we have different thoughts and different feelings coming and going, coming and going. And so I think we all do have compassion, and it might pop up, and then maybe there's a moment of pride or a moment of anger or something else, or fear, but then it comes back to compassion. So I think, compassion is probably there, and anybody who does a rescue an action of rescuing, but there could also be other things as well. I don't think that's, and that doesn't deny that there's compassion there. Yeah, there is compassion, but there's other things as well that might make the compassion a little bit impure or polluted, not 100% pure. But again, we're just normal human beings. We're not Buddhas. And in the case of a Buddha, there is no pride, no ego, no showing off. It's just pure compassion. But until we're Buddha, it's just natural that we could have these other states of mind. But that doesn't cancel out the compassion. And then the question also mentioned the people who didn't climb the building to rescue the child. That doesn't mean they didn't have compassion. They probably had compassion too, but maybe there were other things that were in the way of them acting out their compassion, maybe fear. I think I would be afraid to run up the side of a building. I'm not very good at climbing. Or your age, your physical age, your physical situation. You may just not have the energy and the ability to do what that man did. I think he was quite a young man and he was probably quite in good shape. And so he probably had the confidence that he could do it and he just did it. So people who don't behave that way doesn't mean they don't have compassion. Yeah, but they had other things going on in their mind that prevented them from doing that. So I hope that answers that question. It also mentioned self-pity when people don't act in a situation like that. So yeah, that happens too. Like if there is a person or a being in trouble and we don't act to help them because of fear or because of physical limitations or whatever, and then we may feel guilty afterwards, beat ourselves up. Why didn't I help? Why didn't I act? Well, that doesn't do any good. I mean, that doesn't help. That's actually a lack of self-compassion, which is what we're going to talk about next. Next on the list is self-hatred, self-criticalness, a lack of compassion for oneself. So that's a very big problem in the West. Many people have that problem. But I don't think it's right to think that if you don't act to help somebody in need, that doesn't mean you're not compassionate. You might still have the compassion, but it might be blocked or hindered by other things, other factors. And it could also just be a question of knowledge. For example, if somebody had a heart attack in front of me and they're collapsed on the ground, I don't have the knowledge and the ability to know what to do. I would find somebody else who does know. I mean, that's also acting, right? Calling the emergency number, calling an ambulance, trying to get a doctor, a medical worker there to help this person. Okay, so just because you don't act doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, you're at fault, you should feel bad, you should feel guilty. You can still very much have compassion for this person, but you just have limitations on your ability to help. And that's not a bad thing. Okay? You shouldn't beat yourself up about it. So I hope that answers the question. Oh yeah, another part of the question was to re-explain the difference between pity and compassion. So I gave that last night. And this is from Stephen Levine, who worked with dying people. So he was very much around a lot of suffering. And so he said, when our fear touches another person's suffering, that is pity. When our compassion touches another person's suffering, when our love touches another person's suffering, that is compassion. So the way I understand that is if we see somebody who's suffering, we might have fear. There might be fear, for example, I don't want to get too close because I might get hurt. I might suffer. My comfort, my happiness might be disrupted. And so we kind of stand back, keep distance. We do feel concern for the other person, but there's a lot of fear that prevents us from acting. So I think that's what he is talking about when he says that's actually pity. I wouldn't say it's totally devoid of compassion. There may be compassion there, but it's kind of maybe overwhelmed by fear or other factors. And then on the other hand, with genuine compassion, we'll talk about this later. Compassion actually gives courage, courageous compassion. It gives you courage. Like in the case of that man, he had the courage to just run up the side of this building to rescue the child, even though he could have injured himself. And also other people who do rescue work, like firemen. Yeah, they run into burning buildings, go into dangerous situations. So sometimes getting injured or even getting killed in the process of what they're doing. So compassion can give us courage to just go into situations where we can help somebody and relieve their suffering. And he says this is connected with love. We really care about the other person, want them to be happy, want them to be free of suffering. And so we just put ourselves there to do whatever we can to help them. So that's how I understand the difference between compassion and pity. So to continue with the material that I prepared, if the outline could be put back up, the next point we come to is self-compassion and compassion for others. So actually in Thupten Jinpa's book, there's a whole chapter on this. So first of all, what is self-compassion? And he starts off talking about what it's not, because I think some people might have misunderstanding, mistaken ideas about what it is. So he says, it is not narcissistic self-absorption. Okay, so self-compassion doesn't mean you're just totally absorbed in yourself with narcissism, in love with yourself and enamored of yourself and only caring about yourself. That is not self-compassion. Because he says, people who do have compassion for themselves, they do take care of themselves, but they are also attentive and caring towards others. Okay, so genuine self-compassion doesn't make us indifferent or uncaring towards others. We do take care of ourselves, but we also are caring towards others. As he says, on the other hand, people who are selfish, people who are self-absorbed, self-centered, usually don't take care of others. They just care about themselves. Okay, so there is a difference between being self-compassionate and self-centered. He says also it's not self-pity. Self-pity is when we get totally absorbed in our own problems and, we're just constantly thinking about and talking about our problems, my problems, and then we might exaggerate them so they seem really huge. So that's not self-compassion. That's self-pity. And he says, when you have self-compassion, you have a sense of proportion that helps you deal with your problems in constructive ways. So in other words, instead of just getting absorbed in your problems and feeling sorry for yourself, you have intelligence to find solutions for your problems, get yourself out of your problems. And then thirdly, he says, self-compassion is not self-gratification, where you're just constantly feeding your own desires and your wishes. That actually might be harmful to yourself. You know, for example, if you like certain types of food that may not be very good for you, and you just overeat, eat too much of that kind of food, then you may harm your health. So that's not self-compassion. Okay, that's self-gratification. And he says it's also not the same as self-esteem. And he spent quite a bit of time talking about self-esteem because in American society, this has become a really big topic. And for example, parents trying to make sure their children have self-esteem and don't think badly of themselves. However, this drive for self-esteem is often based on achieving. Yeah, your self-esteem is tied to how well you do in school, what kind of grades you get, or in sports, athletics. Yeah, so you do really well, and then you can feel good about yourself. So he says that's actually dangerous. If your self-esteem is tied to things like that, achievement in school, in sports, in business, and so on. So that's not the meaning of self-compassion. So he says what it is, what self-compassion is. He says with self-compassion, we relate to ourselves, especially to our struggles and our failures, with understanding, with kindness, with acceptance. So we're kind to ourselves, we accept ourselves. It's a gentle, caring, clear-seeing, yet non-judgmental orientation of our heart and mind towards our own suffering and needs. And if you are interested in this topic of self-compassion, there's an American psychologist, Kristen Neff, who spent 10 years doing research on self-compassion. And after that, she wrote a book titled Self-Compassion. It might be in French. She also has a website you can go to, and there's materials there about self-compassion. And Thupten Jinpa says that when the Dalai Lama first heard about the Western problem of self-hatred, there was some conference with Western therapists, Western psychologists, and they were talking about self-hatred. And the Dalai Lama, when he heard about this, was puzzled. He found it difficult to understand that people would hate themselves. In Buddhism, we have this idea that all living beings want happiness, all living beings want to be free of suffering. So this wish for happiness, wish to be free of suffering is kind of caring for oneself. So His Holiness had the idea, but you know, everybody should feel that way. Why would they hate themselves? So then he came to understand, the Dalai Lama came to understand that this self-hatred is actually based on caring for oneself, because hatred is a form of caring. If we didn't care, we wouldn't hate. Interesting idea. But the problem is we do care a lot about ourselves, but we're unable to accept ourselves or forgive ourselves for our faults, our imperfections. So having self-hatred, self-criticalness doesn't mean you don't care about yourself, but you find it difficult to accept yourself as you are and forgive yourself for your mistakes. And there's Kristen Nath and probably others as well offer practices, trainings for how to be more self-compassionate. And in fact, some of the exercises in the book are about self-compassion. If we have time, we'll do one of these before we finish today. So that's general meaning of what is self-compassion. So it's compassion directed towards oneself. So that means we recognize suffering, problems, difficulties in ourselves. We have concern, sympathy for our suffering, and we want to do what we can to relieve that suffering. We want ourselves to be free of suffering and to have happiness. And the second point says, it doesn't make us selfish. So the book says that studies show that people who are self-compassionate are caring for others. So that was already mentioned above, that genuine self-compassion doesn't make you selfish. You take care of your own needs, and because your own needs are taken care of, you are happier, you are doing well, and naturally you want to share that with others. You want to bring your good experiences to others and benefit them as well. So genuine self-compassion is very different from selfishness, self-centeredness. And then the third point says, can we have compassion for others if we don't have it for ourselves? So that is a common idea. And in fact, I mentioned that last night, that the Dalai Lama says this sometimes, that if we don't like ourselves, it'll be difficult for us to like others. To a certain extent, I think that is true. I can see that in my own case, because I have this problem of being very critical of myself, having high expectations of myself, feeling bad if I don't live up to my expectations. So I've had this problem all my life. And what I see in myself is that if I'm critical of certain things in myself, then when I see those same things in other people, I will be critical of them as well. Yeah. So for example, if like being attached to food, I like food, but I also kind of beat myself up and feel bad and feel guilty for being attached to food. So then when I see other people who have that problem too, or I think they have that problem, they look like they're attached to food, then I'll feel critical, judgmental of them. Yeah. So judging oneself for something will lead to judging others for that same thing. And that is an obstacle to compassion. So I think it is true that if we can be more compassionate, more accepting, more forgiving of our own faults and mistakes and imperfections, then when we see those same faults and imperfections in other people, it'll be easier to accept them rather than being critical, judgmental. However, Thupten Jinpa says that this isn't completely true, because he says some people who are very altruistic and very compassionate, and do a lot for others, they can still be very hard on themselves, very, unkind to themselves. So it is possible. It is possible to be hard on yourself, but still be compassionate to others and do things for others. But he says this can lead to problems in the long run. For example, you might get emotionally burned out. If you're judging yourself and critical of yourself, then this is not good for your mind and your energy. So you might get burned out. Also, another thing that can happen is bitterness. I recall a friend telling me of a woman that she knew, and this woman had spent her whole life doing things for others, her family, her friends. She was always active, doing things for other people and not really taking care of herself. And then in the later part of her life, she was somewhat elderly, and she herself was in need of help. And then she started getting bitter about what she had done. Like, oh, I spent all that time and energy taking care of other people, and now they're not taking care of me. So she actually her mind kind of turned around, and she became kind of bitter and even, regretting all the things that she had done for others. So I think that probably her work for others, doing things for others, maybe it wasn't completely compassion. It may have been something else, or maybe it was partly compassion, but partly maybe wanting people to like her, wanting to be accepted, to be loved, to be appreciated. So that happens sometimes, that when we do things for others, there is a certain amount of expectation of getting something in return for what we do, which isn't pure compassion. And then that can turn out to bring problems in the end. So anyway, this is a little bit of a complex question. It seems that to a certain extent, we can be compassionate and helpful to others, even if we're not compassionate to ourselves, but this will probably bring problems in the long run. And so ideally, we have compassion for both oneself and for others. That would be the thing to work towards. So we have a little bit of time left before the break. Let's do a little meditation related to this. This is again from Thupten Jinpa's book, and it's forgiving oneself, self-forgiveness. That can be difficult sometimes, but we do need to learn how to do it. So make yourself comfortable. Settle down your mind. You can put your attention on your breathing. Be aware of your breath coming in and going out for a few moments. Put aside other thoughts that are not related to what we are doing. So now bring to mind something that you did in the past that you regret, you wish you hadn't done. You could have been speaking harshly to somebody, hurting somebody's feelings. Or acting out some kind of desire or attachment that you knew wasn't good for you. Making some mistake. So we might have many such experiences, but just choose one. And try to notice if you are judgmental, critical, or even hateful towards yourself for having done this action. Now, when we act in unwise, unskillful ways, there's usually a need behind it. There may have been a need to be heard, to be understood by another person, to be recognized and respected. Or to be relieved of our suffering, our anxiety. So there's this deeper need that isn't being met. And based on that, we act in this unwise or unskillful way. So just check to see if that's true. See if there was some need inside of you, deep down inside, that led you to act in that way. And if you are able to recognize the need that you had, see if you can feel a sense of acceptance, acknowledgement, kindness, and compassion towards yourself for having this need. It's just a basic human need. Probably everybody has at some times. It's not wrong, it's not bad to have these needs. So although that underlying need is something valid, something understandable, the way we acted out of that need may have been unwise, unskillful. And so it may be appropriate to feel regret for the way we acted. But that doesn't mean hating ourselves, beating ourselves up, thinking we're bad and horrible just because we acted that way. We were acting because we needed something. It was like a cry for help. So with that understanding, see if you can extend forgiveness towards yourself. Forgive yourself for the way you behaved. So that may not have been enough time for you to reach the conclusion of self-forgiveness, but it gives you an idea of how you can learn forgiveness for yourself. So then you could try it again on your own and spend as much time as you need to in order to generate that feeling of self-forgiveness. It is important to do that because I think if we can't forgive ourselves for our faults, our mistakes, our unskillful actions, then it becomes very difficult to forgive other people. When it comes to other people and their mistakes, their faults, their unwise actions, we might hang on to anger, resentment, even hatred. And that's not good, not healthy, and is an obstacle to compassion. So learning to forgive ourselves and be compassionate towards ourselves for our mistakes will help us to be forgiving towards other people. So it's good to at least see the importance of that, and that's something to work on, however much time it takes. Okay, so let's take a break for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and do some more. To have little groups again and let you share your experiences of that meditation that we just did, self-forgiveness. Whether you found you were able to do it or not, and if you had difficulty with it, why was it difficult? What kind of things do you need to overcome in order to have the sense of self-forgiveness for yourself? I know it's a huge topic and you'd probably spend hours discussing it, but just to have a little bit of chance to discuss it before we move on to the next material, because the next material we'll get into are obstacles to compassion. What is it that prevents us from having compassion? And these obstacles are not permanent, fixed things that we can't overcome. If we identify what the obstacles are, then there are methods, there are remedies to these obstacles. So if we can reduce the obstacles, then we have a greater chance of increasing our compassion. So let's try, how much time? 15 minutes? I heard last time there wasn't enough time for you to discuss. So let's try 15 minutes. So I hope you had sufficient time to have a nice discussion about that topic. So let's go on and start to look at obstacles to compassion. I put down quite a few, and you might recognize some of these in yourself. So could we have so the first one on the list is cruelty. And in the Pali tradition of Buddhism, each of the four immeasurable thoughts, like compassion, love, and so forth, has an enemy, something that's totally opposite to it. So for compassion, the far enemy is said to be cruelty, which is like the totally opposite state of mind. Compassion wishes for sentient beings, for other people, and so on, to be free of suffering, to not suffer. Whereas cruelty is totally the opposite of that. It's wanting to make somebody suffer. And so we have all kinds of stories, terrible stories of torture. Yeah, torture that happens in war, when there's two parties fighting each other. And if one side captures the other, then they can sometimes inflict torture on them. But also just in normal society, we hear sometimes of acts of incredible cruelty, even with children who bully other children, especially those who are smaller, younger, and sometimes animals, torturing animals. So this is horrible. I'm sure when we hear of these stories, we just feel, oh, how terrible. How could people do such things? So we may not have any inclination to behave that way. But on the other hand, we might have something similar to that. If there's somebody we dislike, and if we hear of that person going through difficulties, having some problem, some difficulty, then we might feel happy. Yeah. Secretly, we probably feel very ashamed of having such thoughts. We wouldn't want to admit them to anybody, but deep down in our mind, we may think, ha, 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 you got what you deserved. I'm glad you're suffering. So that's that kind of mind. And it is, something negative and an obstacle to compassion. Because according to Buddhism, ideally, we develop compassion for everybody, not just a limited number of people or beings, and then leave out others. But the ideal is to have compassion for everybody. And that includes those who do harmful things, those who cause suffering and problems to others. And this is very difficult, of course. It's not easy, but it's not impossible. If we really work on cultivating compassion, then it is possible to have compassion even for those who do harmful things. I was just thinking this morning of there was some incident in the last couple of years in America. And I think, if I remember correctly, if it was one person or a group of people, they went into a synagogue and there was, I don't know, some kind of celebration or maybe a wedding going on. And there was acts of violence, shooting or whatever. So a number of people were killed, were injured. And the people who were doing this action were also shot and injured. I don't remember all the details, but what I do remember was one of the attackers, and it was a hate crime. It was clearly a hate crime, anti-Semitic hate crime. So one of the attackers was taken to the hospital because he was wounded, and he was taken care of by a Jewish doctor. And there was some, article about this in the news, and this doctor was saying, he took care of this person. He didn't have anger or hatred, and refused to treat this wounded man. He saw him as a suffering person and cared for him as he would care for anybody. So that was quite an extraordinary act of compassion, even though this patient had done this horrible, violent act against Jewish people, specifically targeting Jewish people. And this doctor himself was Jewish, but he didn't let that affect his mind and say, no, I'm not going to take care of this person. I'm not going to heal this person. So there's lots of examples like that of people who are able to have compassion and care even for those who do harmful things, even towards one's own family or group. So I will talk later. I have the plan to go into this later. What are some things we can do in order to overcome feelings of anger or hatred towards those who do harmful things and be able to have compassion for them? I mean, basically, if we can just understand that they are suffering too. So somebody who does harmful things, somebody who themselves has hatred and acts violently and causes harm to others, that person is not happy. That person is not in a positive, peaceful state of mind, but their mind is like tortured by their delusions, their afflictions. What we say in Buddhism, the three poisonous minds of greed, hatred, ignorance. So they have all these afflictive states of mind and they have no control. It's like their mind is controlled by these afflictions, by these delusions. And so they're like somebody who's mentally ill, right? They're mentally ill and they're not a happy person. Yeah, they're actually mentally, psychologically suffering. Not only that, but if they are doing harmful actions, harming others, creating negative karma, then in the future, they're going to have even more suffering. They're creating suffering for themselves. So these are the main thoughts or things to contemplate about a harm doer, that if we keep thinking about that again and again, it will help us to stop having anger and hatred towards them and instead have compassion. Because we realize, well, that person deserves compassion too. They are suffering too. So that's basically how you can do that, in case you're desperate to know right now. But I will talk about that later, and we can do some meditation on it probably tomorrow. So if we do have such thoughts or attitudes in our mind, like cruelty, anger, hatred, don't beat yourself up about it. Yeah. Don't get into self-hatred, self-criticalness, feel guilty. That doesn't help. Just know that those thoughts are impermanent. They're not permanent. They're not always there. They come and go in your mind. And they're also impermanent in the sense that we can change our mind. We can work on our mind so that we can reduce those negative states and increase positive ones, such as compassion and love. So our mind is changeable. We can change it. So that can help us to be more patient with ourselves, more kind to ourselves, and put your energy into trying to increase your compassion. The more compassion and love and these positive attitudes we have, then the more they will become our norm, our default mode, our natural way of being. And then the anger and the hatred and so on will gradually decrease, become less and less. I can say that with confidence. I can see that in myself, having learned Buddhism and practiced it for many years. I can definitely say that my anger has decreased very much. My kindness and compassion have increased. I still have a long way to go, but I can see that it does work. If you do put time and energy into practicing these methods, they do bring about a change in your mind. Then number 2 is pity, and that is called the near enemy of compassion, meaning that it's not compassion, but it's similar. It looks similar, and you might even misidentify pity for compassion. So I've already explained the meaning of pity, what it is. So then we just need to observe our mind, our experience, and try to notice if what we are feeling is genuine compassion or if it's this one, pity. And I think that working on generating compassion, like doing the practices, the meditations for generating compassion, will help us have more genuine compassion. And working on fear, which is the next obstacle, working on decreasing our fear will help us to have less pity. Because fear, as Stephen Levine said, that's part of pity, when we're kind of afraid of suffering and want to stay distant from suffering and don't know how to deal with suffering. So that's what can lead to pity rather than compassion. So working on our fear will help. So that's number 3 then on the list, fear. And I will talk more about that later, because Thupten Jinpa has a whole chapter in his book on fear of compassion. There's actually different ways of experiencing fear. Some people are afraid of receiving compassion from others. Some people are afraid of giving compassion to others. So there's different ways that fear can interfere with compassion. So we'll look at that more later But as long as you understand that fear isn't something permanent, and it's, you can overcome fear, you can reduce fear. It has its causes and conditions, and when we work on it, we can have less fear and more courage. So it's something that there's a remedy. There are remedies for it. We can overcome it. Okay, so number 4 is denial. And this is partly from my own experience. Because when I was young, still a student in university, that's the time when I first started learning a little bit about Buddhism. I was already interested then, and I met a person who was a Zen practitioner. She was studying Zen and doing Zen meditation. So when I found that out, I said, "Oh, I'm really interested to know more about Buddhism. Can you tell me something about it?" So she started talking about the 4 Noble Truths. And the first Noble Truth, as you probably know, is called the truth of suffering. And that simply means that there's a lot of suffering, a lot of problems in life. And as soon as she said that, I had this reaction. I said, "Oh, how can you say that? Life is wonderful. Life is beautiful." And she looked straight in my face and she said, "I can see that you are suffering." And it was almost like she slapped me in the face. Not literally, but it was just such a shock. And I was left speechless because I knew that she was right. She'd seen through my denial. I was in denial. Denying that I had suffering, denying that, there were things wrong with my life, with life in general. So that's what I mean by denial. And I think this is common. I think many people, it's more like wishful thinking. We would like to think that life is wonderful, life is beautiful, there isn't any suffering. But it's not true. It's denial. It's denying the truth. There is suffering. Suffering does exist. So if this is something you find in yourself, it could be good to look at that and try to understand why there is this denial. I mean, in my own case, I think it was fear. I was just kind of on the verge of adulthood. I was about 19 or so. And, it's like you have your life ahead of you. And I was trying to think that, yeah, it's going to be wonderful. But, in doing that, I was denying the reality that actually I did have a lot of unhappiness, a lot of problems, a lot of confusion. So I was just trying to ignore those things and hope that they would go away by themselves. But they don't. Problems don't go away by themselves. You do have to look at them. And so, this is why the Buddha spoke about the truth of suffering. He says, we have to look at it. We have to acknowledge it. It's there, and it will not go away just by ignoring it. We can overcome suffering. We can be free of suffering, but we first have to face it. We have to acknowledge it. But then, if we do acknowledge suffering, then we might encounter the 5th problem, number 5, which is despair. So that means when we do start to open up our mind and acknowledge suffering, then we might get overwhelmed by it. There's so much of it. And this is particularly true today because of news and and the internet and social media. So information, like instantly, almost instantly, as soon as there's been some tragedy, a murder, suicide bombing, a war, whatever, almost immediately it's in the news. And I don't do social media, but I imagine people have apps on their phones. So as soon as there's some kind of news item, it comes immediately into their phone. Is that true? Does that happen? That you kind of can immediately find out about some tragedy when it happens. So there's a lot of tragedies. And so that means like all day long, we might be getting these news bites about terrible things happening. And the news usually does focus on the bad things. Most of the news is about bad things and not so much about good things. And I think partly that's because it's sensational. Yeah, it will grab people's attention. And the news, TV stations and newspapers and so on, they want people to continue paying attention and buying them. And, they don't want to go out of business. So they keep giving news that's sensational, that's shocking, that will grab people's attention. Because good news can be boring. There's actually a lot of good news, but we don't hear about it very much, probably because it's boring, everyday life. So anyway, it's easy if you pay attention to the news to get this lopsided view, this distorted view that, the world is terrible. There's so many terrible things happening. People are terrible. They're doing terrible things to each other. So you can easily get overwhelmed by the suffering and then have a feeling of despair, or like the Dalai Lama calls it, personal distress. You just feel, there's so many terrible things happening and I can't do anything about it. And you could get into a very bad state of mind. So these two, number 4 and number 5, are almost like two extremes. On the one hand, totally denying and thinking, pretending everything is wonderful when it isn't. But then on the other hand, despair, thinking everything is terrible and hopeless. So both of those are not helpful. And the ideal would be to find a middle way between them. The middle way would be acknowledging the existence of suffering and problems, but only to the extent that we don't fall into despair. And actually, compassion itself, the more we develop compassion, train in compassion, then I think that it will give us a more healthy outlook, because we know, yes, there's suffering, and I want to do as much as I can to alleviate suffering, but at the same time, I'm limited. I have limitations. I can't make it all go away. Even if I was a Buddha, even a Buddha can't make all the problems and suffering in the world go away. But we can do certain things. We can work on our own mind, increase our compassion, our love, our wish to help. We can help as much as we can, do as many things as we can, but we also have to acknowledge that we can't do everything. We do have limitations, and be comfortable with that. So this may take time. It took me time to get to that point, but I think there's a lot of ideas in Buddhism that are very helpful to get to this point. One is impermanence. We talk a lot about impermanence and how things are impermanent, meaning they don't last forever. So that's true about suffering. There is suffering, but it's not permanent. There's no suffering that's permanent, that's going to be there forever and ever and ever. All suffering will come to an end. So if we remind ourselves of that suffering will end, then that can help us be more relaxed and breathe. And be practical. Just to think, okay, there's problems, and I will do as much as I can to alleviate suffering, to help others be free of suffering. But beyond that, I cannot do more. Cannot do more than that. So being able to recognize what we can do and what we can't do, and acknowledge that and be comfortable with that. But we also recognize that we can work on ourselves. That's the Bodhisattva's path. I can work on myself, develop my compassion, my love, my wisdom, my qualities. And as time goes on, I can become more and more helpful to others. And eventually, I can even become a Buddha, fully enlightened, and then I'll be able to help others in a very vast way. So those are some of the ideas that can help us to have a more realistic view about suffering and problems, so that we don't fall into denial nor into despair. Maybe that's a good note to end on. We do need to end early. I understand Nadia has to go. So I don't want to make her late. So we will continue from tomorrow with other obstacles and look at remedies for them. And we'll also do some more meditations on compassion. And again, if you have questions, send them in to the center, and I will try to answer them as much as I can. So let's take a few minutes to make a mental dedication of the positive energy that we have created today. So we've spent 4 hours altogether listening, thinking about, meditating on, discussing these teachings on compassion, which is such a beautiful topic. And we did all this with a good motivation, wanting to help others, wanting to help the world. So we definitely created some good energy, merit, we call it in Buddhism. So now let's share this merit with others. Just making the prayer, by the positive energy we've created, may all living beings be free of their suffering and the causes of suffering. May they have genuine peace and happiness, and the causes of those positive states of mind, positive ways of behaving. And may all of us, as quickly as possible, reach the fulfillment of our highest potential, the state of enlightenment. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Nadia, for translating, Elizabeth and Arnaud for organizing.
Thank you, Venerable.
Good evening. See you tomorrow.
Bye. Thank you.
Merci.
Bye-bye.